But first, here on Radio 4, in the second in the series, anthropologist and linguist Mark Turin heads to South Africa to find out how the country came to have 11 official languages. In our language, in your hands.
South Africa is a country where language is, and always has been, highly politicized, from its founding to the present day. As the citizens of this self-proclaimed rainbow nation broke free from the divisions imposed on them by the apartheid regime, language lay at the heart of their struggle, particularly in the southwestern townships, or Soweto.
June the 16th is about the children of Soweto. On that winter's day, now such an integral part of this country's history, black students were protesting against schooling in Afrikaans.
The 1976 uprising by school children in Soweto was triggered by rebellion against the enforced imposition of Afrikaans in the schools. The language issue then was the trigger rather than the cause. The cause was apartheid. The cause was domination. This was now the last straw.
Former Judge Albie Sachs, who lost an arm and sight in one eye through his struggle against apartheid.
Language for the Afrikaner nationalists had been central to their identity, their being, their struggle, and they could just about imagine conceding democracy and could just about imagine a constitution in which black and white were equal. But if Afrikaans was downgraded, boom.
Who's that dude with the...
I've come to Soweto to see what has changed since 1976. And as a linguist, this diversity and mix of languages is fascinating.
So how many languages do you all speak?
It's 3. It's English, Zulu, and Xhosa.
Now, when you're all together here, just chatting in the playground, what language do you speak together?
Combine, because we all can understand it.
Really?
Yes. We combine English, we combine Zulu, Xhosa, and Xhosa.
Okay, so can you do that for me now? Pretend I'm not here. Just combine. Go on.
Yes.
The name of the school is Pefeni Senior Secondary School, or you could just say Pefeni High School in Orlando West, and literally opposite Nelson Mandela's old home.
Journalist Milton Nkosi is a former pupil at the school.
This is where I was born, this is where I grew up, and this is where I was shaped and formed to be the man who's speaking to you right now.
What has changed in this school?
You know the saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So a lot has changed and a lot hasn't changed. I remember, you see this square here, we used to play chess here. But the children in their curriculum, they now learn languages without having to learn Afrikaans.
South Africa's post-apartheid constitution enshrined the rights of the country's languages, and Albie Sachs played an important role in its formulation.
No language rights already existing in South Africa should be diminished, which meant the status of English and Afrikaans would not be reduced. But the language rights of the great majority of the people who'd been marginalized, their rights had to be upgraded. And in 2 sentences, we had solved the basic dilemma of the language question in South Africa. No language is more important than any other language.
How many languages do you speak?
In total, I speak 7.
My mother tongue is Xhosa, but languages that I picked up along the way are Zulu, Sotho, Tswana.
I speak more or less confidently about 5 languages, and if I want to stretch it, I could take it to about 7.
So yes, so you'd sort of like you're biting your tongue just on the side, and then push some air out. That's better than you said before. But now you're saying your front leg now, so that would be Xhosa.
Yes. I was struck flying in this morning on South African Airways how the linguistic policy of the nation is a matter of national pride. The cabin attendant or purser said, "Welcome to South Africa, where we have 11 official languages." Of course, this is great grist to my mill as an incoming field linguist. But it must have been quite a moment of transformation to go from 2 to 11, was there much jostling and politics involved? And were some languages aspiring to get on the official list but just didn't make it?
I think that there was a lot of jostling and that the 11 language policy surprised everybody.
Professor Raj Mestri is a linguist at the University of Cape Town.
Many people anticipated that there'd be perhaps one official language in the country, maybe two, maybe three, but I think we all anticipated that the local African languages would at long last be recognized at a national and official level. So the 11 includes English, which was previously an official language in the country, Afrikaans, and it includes 9 of the major African languages. These 9 being Zulu, very large, over 10 million speakers, but not spoken throughout the country. isiXhosa or Xhosa, perhaps best known as the mother tongue of Nelson Mandela, also a very large language, over 10 million speakers today. And still large languages like North Sotho, South Sotho, Tswana, and then smaller languages, Tsonga and Venda, having just around 1 million speakers each, and Swazi or Siswati.
Just cleared security in the South African Parliament, and I'm waiting for our host, who's the head of the interpretation section, standing in line with about 50 women dressed in their finery. Think of how many languages are spoken just in this line. They're here for an afternoon sitting, and I want to see how languages work in Parliament, the 11 official languages of South Africa. Who uses them, who translates them, and what for?
Okay, let's go.
Abu Bakr Peterson, who's the manager of the interpretation unit, is giving us a guided tour.
As you can see, isiZulu, isiXhosa, we've put windows in between so that everybody can see each other.
There are 2 people interpreting in there right now. They take it in turns, actually. One is on mic and one is off. They're watching a screen, which is a closed-circuit screen from the sitting parliament right now. And in the corner of that screen, there's a signer doing South African Sign Language. This is a multilingual scenario. They're listening to English interpreting into Xhosa, and they can look through the window and see their colleagues interpreting into other languages. In terms of the distribution of the languages used in Parliament by the members themselves, do they follow roughly the diversity and the speaker numbers of the nation?
Yeah, they do. Majority of the population speak isiZulu. The majority of the members speak isiZulu. Even those members who are not culturally isiZulu, they speak isiZulu. And then we have English, Afrikaans, isiXhosa, Sesotho, Sepedi, and some of the other languages would follow.
The evidence and complaints that workers have given us that they were victimized and harassed by farm owners will be investigated, and it will not be swept under the carpet as you would like.
Usifundazwe sezolimo uthe akukho zinkinga emaplazini ugwebiwe udosika unedo itori mita ukono wana uchikovu angwaye zitu.
South Africa is noticeably and impressively plurilingual. One of the extraordinary things about just watching South Africans speak with each other is the way that they may speak an English sentence and use an Afrikaans adjective, import a Xhosa word. When that's happening in a debate, how do people interpret that? Because there's so many languages coming together in one space. Do they interpret every single word, or do they stop when they don't hear a Zulu word? How does that work?
Fortunately, most of our interpreters are multilingual. Most of them speak isiXhosa, most of them speak isiZulu or understand it. So when a few languages are used, and it's usually the isiZulu words and the Sesotho words that are the common ones that are interspersed, and Afrikaans also. Some of the languages share many roots with Afrikaans. Afrikaans, for example, is a venster. A window is a venster. One or two other languages will say vensteri. So they know that. Or a table is a tafel. Itafili.
I'm standing outside a suite of interpreters' booths for the National Council of the Provinces. From every different corner I can hear a different language being interpreted. And here, because the doors are not soundproof, we can hear a little bit of each language. This is a microcosm, a snapshot of the linguistic diversity of South Africa. It's not just politicians who are working in a range of different languages. Artists, writers, filmmakers are also finding a voice in their own tongue.
My name is Ndaba Gangwane. I'm writer, producer, and director of the film Uhlanga, The Mark. When I first scripted the film, I made that conscious decision to say, you know what, the film will be in Zulu. I need to make sure that the language that is used in the film is the language that people can connect to, can understand, even the older people, because the older people speak a lot of the languages as well. And I felt, you know what, this is an opportunity for me to present this in my mother tongue, and a lot of people will understand it. And again, with the actors, you find that our English may not necessarily be perfect, and they may struggle here and there if the script is in English. And what then generally happens is that they focus more on correcting their English mistakes. They focus more on trying to perfect the language, doing it in Zulu. It comes naturally to them to speak the language. I think a lot of people are definitely learning indigenous languages. I've found scenarios where you find a lot of white people in white schools, Afrikaans or English speaking, that want to take up Zulu as a language, for instance, as a second language. And you also either Sotho or Tswana, you find them wanting to learn a black language. And I think it advantages everybody if we all know all these languages. And I see an effort from the side of the English or Afrikaans white-speaking people, that they seem to have a lot of interest in learning the languages. Obviously, it's not the highest grade, but at least it gives them a chance to be able to communicate in a language other than English.
This looks like a British newspaper. It feels as heavy. It's even got the same font. What is it?
The Sunday Times is our flagship newspaper.
Mondli Makanya is editor-in-chief at the Times Media Group, which now publishes a newspaper in Zulu. He's a lot less optimistic about the linguistic landscape of South Africa.
Unfortunately, particularly white South Africans, but also, I would say, kind of like Indian South Africans and to a certain extent colored South Africans, mixed-race South Africans, they have not taken it upon themselves to actually familiarize themselves with the most basic, elementary tenets of the indigenous languages of South Africa. It's actually quite infuriating. You will greet somebody, let's say in Zulu, for instance, you say Sawubona. That everybody should know what Sawubona is. It's the name of the magazine on the national airline. But you'll find that somebody who has lived here all their lives, kind of like somebody who's in like 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever it is, does not know what Sawubona means. And those who do kind of like maybe can say Sawubona and then they'll like giggle and say, I'm sorry, that's as far as I can go. And like with a sense of pride somehow. And it's actually thinking, you're robbing yourself. You know what I'm saying? You're cheating yourself of like this rich cultural and diversity that in this country that you are living in. So Zulu language newspapers or any newspaper that is produced in an indigenous language will have almost 100% exclusive black readership.
To my own great regret, I've never learnt an African language.
Albie Sachs again.
Attempts are being made in the schools to include a third language. If it's just two languages, then water follows the path of least resistance to be English, mainly Afrikaans. That's getting somewhere, but it's very, very slow.
If you were to look at the Khoisan and Nama, they are practically disappearing from the face of the earth. There are very few people who basically interact in that language. It's not taught in schools. And if nothing is done, basically, it's gonna just die.
But as Samuel Jafta, executive manager at the Pan South African Language Board, points out, it's not just a case of persuading white South Africans that learning indigenous African languages has merit. The aspirations of upwardly mobile black South Africans have consequences too.
In terms of the black middle class, they look at English as a means to compete in the world, to have access to jobs, etc. So most parents would definitely, in most cases, push for their children to go to schools where English is a medium of instruction. And it's providing us with a lot of challenges because it's not dealt with in a balanced way. You'd expect that if a school is an English medium instruction school, they would also give parents and students an opportunity to also learn in other languages so that there is that balance. But I think in some of the what we call Model C schools, which are basically attended by blacks that can afford to take their kids to private schools, etc., they tend to lead or to contribute towards the decline of local languages, yes.
There's a huge controversy in South Africa among educated classes of black people where everybody finds themselves in this difficulty where their children are speaking English to them because they send them to good schools, and the good schools invariably are English-speaking schools, and so they have to talk in English with their children. And suddenly you drive half an hour down the motorway to where the parent grew up, and they greet the kid in an African language, and the kid speaks like a total stranger. Daddy, what are they saying? And a lot of that is so painful because the people at the parents' home, the relatives and the friends, they resent that. So a huge debate going on. Dinner parties, that's one of the best topics to get people talking.
I'm very passionate about South Africa's indigenous languages because I think, when we became a democracy in 1994, when South Africa was born, we made this whole hullabaloo about our languages. But then what has happened subsequently is that we've paid lip service to it. And then, in fact, what's happened as the black middle class has grown, you have seen people actually abandoning their languages, speaking English to their own children. And the greatest irony of it is that democracy was supposed to lead to an enrichment and pride in all these languages that have been empowered. But actually, we've actually witnessed the destruction of African languages over the past 18 years. It's really, it's heartbreaking.
My name is Gringo Wachela. I would love to see a situation where my daughter speaks Xhosa fluently and English. Even if it's not a formal Xhosa education, but to have a tutor or somebody who would guide her in doing that. Of course, I speak Xhosa with her. My family speak Xhosa to her. She understands very well. She would get up, stand up, walk, do this, do that in Xhosa.
My name is Pumza Fihlani. Our little girl is 8 months old. Her father is part Zulu, part Xhosa. We're very conscious of having her learn Xhosa, Zulu, and then English. So when I get home, if I'm reading a story to her, I'll read an English story to her, and then Daddy will read a Xhosa story to her. But we're very conscious of having her exposed to those three languages at this point. Probably more Xhosa and Zulu as we start out. And then when we get her ready for school, we wanted to be able to communicate in English as well.
Goeiemiddag, that means good afternoon, hallo. Die ATKV staan vir die taal, vir kunste, vir gemeenskappe en vir onderwys. En die lese wat ons gebruik is vry en volkleur in Afrikaans.
So we're talking about language, the arts, community and education. I'm translating from Afrikaans, and I've come to the Afrikaans Language and Culture Organization to find out what place it has in 21st century South Africa. With its inevitable associations with apartheid, can Afrikaans even be considered an African language? Dr. Danny Titus is the Executive Director for Culture.
In terms of the language, it is still the Afrikaans language within a different context this time. In the old days, it was in a different context because Afrikaans was a minority Afrikaner language, meaning a white language that came from the Dutch. This is the way the story goes in general. And also under the previous apartheid regime, it was very much the dominant language of the ruling party. There is a little bit of a twist to that as well, where people are saying, but this has never been a white language. Because if you look at the history of Afrikaans and you look at the 1652 when Jan van Riebeeck came to set up this little vegetable station, at the Cape, en route to Indonesia, Java at the time, the language of the time was High Dutch, Hoge Hollands. People couldn't speak it. It was really an elitist language. And for the sailors and the whole intercultural mix, people had to find a lingua franca at the time. And that's where they tried to make High Dutch easier. And that's where Afrikaans came.
Kommerende klaar, die kinders skree oor skaarse kos, kan kerke enige kering kry, kama ja. Die konsekwent is konsekwent. Kom, Kaapse kind. Compliment.
Hi, I'm Catherine Hennigan, and I'm the director of Afrikaans, a theatre production about the history of Afrikaans.
Afrikaans is legal, ay, ay. Legal.
We really, in South Africa, need to rediscover our history and know what happened before the apartheid project. The truth of the matter is that Afrikaans was hijacked. Afrikaans was always considered a slave language, a second-rate language, a bastard language. It was a language that was spoken by the lower classes, by the servants and the slaves. This is not a history that I learned at school.
My name is Quentin Goliath, also known as Jitsvanger, which is a Cape slang, which means dope, cool, gehard kif, you know. Yeah. Afrikaans for me is an expression which is very close to what my mother's food in the morning. You know, it's something that I know. I can't explain it in an intellectual way. I just feel it. I know it. It's a rhythm, you know, and it's Afrikaans. It's the way we speak, and it's very Kaaps. In other words, something that exists in Cape Town. It was interesting when I listened to the indigenous languages, for instance, the Khoi Khoi Kuvap, which used a lot of clicks, up to 5 clicks. I can't name them. There's the laterale click, palatale click, and all those ones. Even that one. Then I decided, look, in Afrikaans, we use a certain click sound. And in an interlude or in a skit, we decided to use the figure of speech alliteration. In other words, the first consonant's the same. Let's use one that's the closest to a click in the language, you know, in the Afrikaans language. And I came up with something like consonante keer soos 'n kwas word die ken was klappe kleptoman van kraft en kalse. Katswink strep kaal oor 'n keerslig. Cancel die klas. Eclectic is in die square sit sy vas soos 'n ke in jou klats clueless in jou quest in jou council collapse.
I've never been to a theatre production run by linguists before. You people are amazing.
There are millions of people like myself that were classified as coloured in South Africa, which is a mixed race. Largely people who lived in the Cape, largely people that came from the slave history, that came from the intermarriages of whites and blacks, so to speak, intermarriages with slaves and with Khoi, indigenous peoples, Khoi and San peoples, and that kind of mixture became the basis for a coloured kind of identity. But the argument is that from the coloured people, if one can call it a people, the Afrikaans language has always been the major language, the mother tongue. And if you look at our current census that came out about a month ago, it indicates that coloured people are by far in the majority when it comes to the Afrikaans language, as to white Afrikaans-speaking people.
When you imagine Afrikaans, you imagine apartheid, and they seem to kind of coalesce in one category. But what you're saying, which is so interesting, is that actually there are many, many speakers of Afrikaans who were not at all invested in that regime, were in fact excluded by it. But for them, Afrikaans is a living, vital language and culture.
Absolutely.
Ek steek uit soos 'n chameleon. Ek is nou hier langs jou, dat ek sommer binne in jou TV in.
My name is Janine. I'm known as by the artist name Black Pearl, and I'm from Cape Town. For me, growing up, I've always felt inferior speaking Afrikaans. When I go to town, coming from Mitchell's Plain or from the Cape Flats, being born and raised there, going to supermarkets and places of business, suddenly you have to speak English, you know, and even my parents would do that automatically. So again, it's generational. And I've always felt inferior. I've always felt like the way I speak isn't proper. And that had an impact on me, like I don't belong, like I don't have an important role to play in my society. And we are doing it within a community to each other. You know, so it's no longer the outside factor, you know, or the white people or the black people in Cape Town. treating you like this as now the so-called colored people within their own communities doing it to each other, which is very sad.
Language is so political in South Africa. It's not only about the elites policing the boundaries of language, but as you say, communities themselves. You could be speaking Afrikaans with your next door neighbor at home, and then as soon as you meet each other in a shop, you have to speak in English. The expectation is. And part of your work and the work of Afrikaans is to turn that around and say, this language, Afrikaans, Afrikaans, can be used everywhere in all scenarios. There's nothing to be ashamed of.
Yes, absolutely. That's what I'm saying.
Kom Khoisan, kry terug jou land. Coloureds kom van Khoisan verstand. Kom Khoisan, kry terug jou land. Coloureds kom van Khoisan verstand.
The tables have turned. It's no longer a question of Afrikaans as the oppressive language, the dominant language, but now Afrikaans as a language in relation with all other languages. That we need to interact. And that implies me understanding, is he Zulu or is he Xhosa?
Zulu would be Ngosi sikeleli Afrika maluphakanyisu phondolwayo iva imithandazo yethu Ngosi sikelela thina iAfrika.
The national anthem includes, it starts with Xhosa, and then it's got Sesotho, and then Afrikaans and English. There are ways like that in which the multilingual quality of South Africa is expressed.
Despite South Africa's progressive policy towards its many indigenous languages, the issue of language rights is far from resolved. As in many other parts of the world, I've found that English has a larger footprint than the other speech forms of the nation. But in the playgrounds of Soweto, the children have the freedom to play in their own language.
I want to say Khoza, but I want to say it right. Oza. 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 Oza.
Say like you actually allowing A in your mouth. Like Khoza.
Makolo.
No. Kolo. An X.
Oh, wow. One more time. Makolo.
Next week, in the final part of the series, Mark will be in New York to find out what happens when almost all the languages in the world are spoken in one place. Our Language in Your Hands was presented by Mark Turin and produced by Mark Rickards.